Welcome to DNV Market Views, our videocast where we discuss the latest market developments. Today we are switching to a slightly different subject, not quite as commercial, but it has profound consequences on maritime markets. So, an extraordinary subject after an extraordinary MEPC session which, as my today's guest described, was extraordinary in all shapes and forms. The long-awaited net zero framework, a proposed IMO regulatory system to cut greenhouse gas emissions from shipping, failed to reach consensus and was adjourned for 1 year. And now what? We all wonder in what shape, when, and if at all, the net zero framework will come into force. On the other hand, what sort of commercial consequences will this adjournment have? To answer some of those questions, or at least shed light on what we can possibly expect in the coming months, I invited Eirik Nyhus, Director Environment for Maritime at DNV. Many of you will recognize his well-known voice from our DNV Maritime Impact podcast. But what you might not know is that Eirik is also wearing another hat, as a technical advisor to the Norwegian IMO delegation. It means he gets to attend those IMO meetings himself, and he's been doing this for many years. It makes him uniquely qualified to give us a holistic, a little bit of an insider's view of what happened during the last MEPC meeting. My name is Jakub Walenkiewicz, and you are watching Market Views.
Eirik, it's absolute pleasure to have you on our show, and I have to say that you work with us. You are one and only in DNV. And I have to say that catching you is not a very easy thing to do. I'm probably going to quote you because I remember you said that then the last extraordinary session of MPC was extraordinary in pretty much every shape and form.
True.
And then we probably had enough of coverage in the media. We're not going to do this today. I'll try to be a cold sort of headed and look into what really happened, to analyze the situation. I don't want us to be biased pro or against. I know that those discussions these days become extremely emotional, and obviously we understand why. But I mean, let's just start from what really happened, it was between 14th and 17th of October, if I'm not mistaken, yeah. Right? The session is like, there's a lot of noise. I mean, this is important for us from a market point of view. This is we will discuss the consequences, but if we can quickly recap it, is it really over? Is it dead, as some people say?
Well, to cut to the chase, we are on a 1-year coffee break. That's my helicopter perspective on it. Mm-hmm. But as to what actually happened, as you know, we had approval of the regulatory package, the so-called net zero framework, back in April. A fairly robust approval, though with complications, because there was a vote, but it was a fairly convincing vote, etc., etc. So we followed the normal IMO procedure. We went to an adoption meeting. That was an extraordinary one because it had to be shoehorned in for reasons of the strategy and blah, blah, blah. But when we got to London, the mood had shifted slightly, shall we say.
Well, I should assume, because I remember saying like, we have the votes, and then all of a sudden we didn't.
All of a sudden we didn't, right. And I was one of those who were convinced that, yes, this was going to go sailing through. Then things started to turn around, I'd say the week, 10 days before the meeting itself. It became clear on Tuesday morning when we started that there was a certain nervousness in the room. Really. I mean, people were all kinds of rumors flying around. There had been a lot of political pressure of extraordinary nature being applied. That went on through the week as well. Long story short, by the time we got through the procedural Armageddon that we had on Friday, with calls for votes, calls for motions to adjourn, formal procedural steps being invoked, essentially we got to the point where we had a formal motion to adjourn the meeting under the IMO's rules of procedures. That has to be taken into account before you do anything else. And we're kind of on the cusp of going to a decision on adoption, not to adopt. that motion had to be addressed first. It was duly done through the voting mechanism that's embedded in the IMO rules of procedure. And we were, I think, at 15:20, according to my notes, something like that. We went on a one-year coffee break. So the meeting is adjourned. It's not done. We are in limbo, regulatory purgatory, as I've called it in other contexts, for a year. And then we are supposed to reconvene in October next year and continue. Now, that's the formal take on it. Obviously, there's going to be stuff happening this year.
What was exactly the sentiment? Were there a lot of people surprised, or how was the mood?
There was a lot of surprise, I would say, up to and including the Secretary General, I think. We, or at least publicly, great confidence was expressed up to and including the start of the meeting. Though there was recognition that there were differences, both on the policy-based differences and technical-based differences, but there was a significant element of surprise at this meeting. Though I should say that when we started on Tuesday, there was a nervousness. That nervousness was because there was a sense that something was going on, and obviously a lot of people were in the know and had been subject to a lot of pressure over especially the last 14 days, and were unclear on how that pressure would play out. And we saw it during the meeting itself, in the sense that normally where you have going back 6 months, we had a lot of vocal support for the net zero framework, for decarbonization being expressed. Many countries were quiet.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you also, because you probably see that I'm deliberately escaping the geopolitical aspect, which was clearly one of the drivers. But I'm more interested in consensus. Those quiet countries, you could feel like sometimes no geopolitics come your way, and then politics is all about results, not the way you get those results.
Absolutely.
But to me, it's more because it does have consequences for people that are listening to us and building these strategies. How strong was the consensus? Were we worried about the merits of the case, or were we more worried about geopolitics?
I think it's twofold, essentially. The merits of the case seemed to be more or less seen the same way by those who spoke, I would say. But when you drive things through a geopolitical pressure, through applying the diplomatic toolkit, as it were, people also start to look for reasons to justify why they may be changing their minds on things, or just deciding, maybe not even changing their minds, just staying quiet, which is why we're seeing this 40-plus group of countries, previously quite vocal, now being silent, and then a move towards deviating from the consensus that we had 6 months beforehand. And when we have consensus kind of collapsing, it becomes easier for countries to head towards an abstention rather than a yes. So we were worried that the blocks that had looked one way in April were starting to look different now. So the abstain bloc may have grown significantly because of precisely that concerns with consensus. But then when this whole thing blew up on Thursday afternoon and then continued on Friday, and the proposal to adjourn was put forward, that was a kind of a convenient escape hatch for many, I think.
It sounds like, yeah.
Because then you don't have to say yes, you don't have to say no, you don't have to abstain, which also is a statement. You just say, we'll revisit this at a later stage, and maybe in a year's time a miracle will have happened and we'll have consensus of some kind. So I think it was a convenient escape hatch for many, to be honest.
So, but that's in a way is a diplomatic escape, and it's definitely, those people who say, okay, this is all dead right now, that's not necessarily the case.
That's very true. I mean, I want absolutely good to raise that. It's not dead. It's on hold for the moment. So I think we did it as a speed bump rather than a death knell. But the definition of insanity, trying to do the same thing again and again under the same conditions and expecting a different outcome. So while not dead, I do not think we can. If the same thing is put forward in the same way in a year's time, you can expect the same result.
Of course.
So things need to happen.
And exactly, and that leads me to next question, because you did mention that we're on a coffee break, but that we're going to be awfully busy. At least some people are going to be awfully busy during that coffee break.
It's in the spirit of the IMO. It's during coffee breaks and lunches that a lot of the negotiations happen.
So, what is exactly then we need to do along those coffee breaks, for things to change and perhaps not to sort of try the Einstein?
Yeah. Well, at the helicopter level, you have kind of two things that can be done. Yeah. Either you can play with the geopolitics and try to either change the pressure, which I think is a no-go area.
I think that's a little bit it's beyond the IMO to play that game.
It's definitely outside the halls of the IMO and not inside those. Or you can try to change the response to the pressure. That's also outside of the IMO. I think it's fairly utopian to expect fundamental changes in that space. Okay. So that's the one bucket you can of actions you can take. The other one is to look at the framework itself. How is it possible to tweak it? And if so, how can it be adjusted to at least increase the possibility of something going through in a year's time?
Well, exactly, because there were, people were trying to explain their positions, right?
Yeah.
And among those, I remember, and you did mention that, is that it's not very clear how we're going to run the fund in itself, how we're going to support those who would like to adopt the green technologies. I remember that there were voices with the LNG, and I hope you're going to elaborate a little bit how we treat LNG, and not to mention a good old standing, as far as I remember, fuel availability and how much that fuel will be available to shipping. So, well, let's start from how to run the fund. Are we going to fix that?
I think in general, a general IMO fund, I think for the next few years is probably dead in the water, to be honest, because the US specifically have been very clear that they will not accept a United Nations-driven fund, and I think that puts some insurmountable constraints in place for the next year at least. Okay. Now, what can be done through a framework is, obviously you got to look for a plan B. What you can conceivably do is you can kind of take the package, slice it into chunks, spread it out over time. So one possible way, and here I'm speculating, I'm not seeing signals or making predictions, this is pure speculation. But one thing you could do is to put the GFI, the greenhouse gas fuel intensity metric, in play. So you do that as a trial, you get the thing running, where ships are monitoring and reporting.
Proof of concept, in a way.
So essentially, yes, a proof of concept. You get the registry, as it's called, up and running, so you have some of the machinery in place. You could alternatively, you could look at playing around with the greenhouse gas reduction trajectory. That's in one way an easy technical fix, but a difficult political one, by setting that to say 0 the first few years as a trial period. That means that there will be no money flowing into a fund.
But the mechanism
but the mechanism will be there. That, of course, will create a howl of protests from those who have expectations to a fund being there to provide revenue for various purposes. And then you can look at the fund itself. You could think of dissecting that a bit, so that today you have it's essentially two mechanisms in there. One where money goes back to the shipping industry in support of decarbonization activities, the support of the zero and the near zero fuels, energy sources, and technologies. And the other bit is essentially ensuring that developing nations have access to aid when it comes to decarbonization efforts. If you dissect these two and make it a zero-sum game where the money going out from industry goes back to industry, that may be more palatable to opponents of revenue than the other bit.
But in both cases, you really need to narrow down a little bit. It's not enough to say it's going to go back to nations or it's going to go back to industry, because I've had a lot of discussions. It's like, what does it actually mean it goes back to industry? If I'm, as a ship owner, I'm about to build a vessel, and will I be able to apply for funding that will take some of the financial burden off me, right? So these are nuts and bolts of how things actually should or will work. Yeah. And I think people need a bit more clarity. Over
Sure,
here.
and that's a second part of what is going to be happening the coming year, irrespective of the political dimension of the whole thing. We are going to keep working on the guideline package, because remember, we're looking at two things that are going to happen here. First off, it's adoption of the framework itself. That stranded or went on coffee break. But then we have the bit where you have all the attendant guidelines describing in detail how all the attendant component parts of the mechanism is going to work. And that includes the fund setup, it includes the Z&Z rewards mechanism, it includes how to calculate the GFI. There are many components that are going to continue to be worked on for the coming year. And those components can, to varying degrees, be used or reused almost irrespective of what kind of shape or color the final framework looks like.
So what you're saying now, I'm reading in between the lines, and I'm not asking you whether this is going to happen or not, but even if adopted next year, there's a great deal of flexibility in terms of how this actually kicks into life and where eventually the money starts flowing. So it may not be as rigid as the initial proposal. Well, it may be spread into a longer run-in period. So
yeah, I'm outlining essentially an alternative pathway here, because the original pathway is dead.
Now we can say, yeah.
Yes,
of course.
If we try to adopt next year what we tried to adopt a few weeks back, it's not going to fly in a year. Yeah. So things need to change. Then you get into, then you've really opened the whole box of potential changes, and then you can do it. Try to do minimal changes and hope that'll fly. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Or you need to do a more fundamental architecture change. That's more complicated. That may take more time. Which also means that, in my estimation, the original timeline, I mean, it got blown out of the water last month anyway, but formally speaking, we could have a framework entering into force 1st of March 2028 instead of 1st of January 2028, which is not much of a delay.
Yeah, no.
But if you want to do a fundamental redesign of things,
probably will take more time.
It will take more time. But I think that also needs to be done together with a political acceptance of what may possibly fly. And that goes back to this looking for a staged approach where some components may go through and other components are essentially put on hold until whenever.
But perhaps this is what people and industries and companies need as well. I mean, it's more understanding and also more time to make decisions that will ultimately push us towards the net zero. I mean, speaking of availability of fuels, I remember how many years we talked about getting a low sulfur heavy fuel oil, and that was a big question mark. Now we talk about the plethora of new alternative fuels that might potentially help us, and this is not going to happen just because we said so, right?
No, and I think that's actually one of the real negative, very negative fallouts of the decision some weeks back. In that we were hoping, decarbonization proponents at least, that this would send a signal to the supply industry and trigger some final investment decisions, because you would be able to look at the future demand projections and make a business case. Now that certainty is thrown out the window, and you're essentially back to looking at what kind of demand will be driven by the EU regulations or by other potentially upcoming national regulations. I mean, as DNV, we've written a lot about fuel availability in our publications, and it's a big one, and it is a challenge. And by throwing this additional certainty out the window, I think we've increased decision uncertainty rather than decreased decision uncertainty, because at the moment we don't know. It might go either way, right? We
don't know, and we don't have any influence on that, right? This is well outside of the IMO jurisdiction.
No, the IMO
of shipping per se, right? We don't produce fuel ourselves.
IMO and industry can only send signals.
Yeah. But that's interesting, because one more thing, there was a lot of noise. Perhaps you can sort of shed some light. There was a lot of noise speaking about introducing new fuel, and well, arguably, LNG is one of those fuels that, at least outside of gas carriers, was introduced to different ship segments, and it took us a while, 2 decades, give or take. And now there is a lot of sort of uncertainty about how the new regulations would treat LNG, and perhaps disadvantaged in LNG. I mean, what happened really over there?
Well, yeah, I think there is a lot of misconceptions out there to varying degrees, because at its core, the proposed regulations are designed to be technology neutral. There are discussions on some ways of potentially adjusting support that goes to the support for the zero net zero framework and what kind of technologies should be incentivized. But that's a kind of separate discussion, so we'll park that one for now. But when it comes to how you treat different molecules, the reg was and is designed to be technology neutral. But there is this. The regulation itself does not speak to LNG, it does not speak to fossils, it does not speak to ammonia as such. It speaks to the greenhouse gas fuel intensity of the molecules being used. And how to calculate those intensities, what intensities to use when you run the numbers and see what your penalty is going to be or not be, that goes back to guidelines, the so-called life cycle analysis guidelines. There are simply decisions pending that haven't been made yet. And I think that many stakeholders out there were looking at the worst case assumptions and saying, well, if it goes this way, then that'll essentially eliminate the business case for LNG, which in principle could be the case if things really went pear-shaped. If we had some of the really poor numbers being accepted and going through, LNG would not look great. But as part of that process, many proposals have been put forward for more reasonable numbers. We expect to see those numbers actually being part of the decision. And in that case, you will see footprints from LNG that are significantly better than what you'll see from fossil fuels.
So still I can expect to be...
Yeah, but if you expect, for instance, and this goes back to the EU, it will be not the same as what we are seeing with the EU regulations at the moment. So there will be a difference and discrepancy there, and that is also, I think, a root of many of the concerns being raised. But at the end of the day, it's supposed to be a tech-neutral regulation. We are working as IMO on these LCA guidelines. There is expected to be decisions on LNG numbers at MEPC 84, which is in April 2026. And I'm pretty confident that we'll get something that's workable coming out of that process.
It's a work in progress.
It's a work in progress, for sure.
All right, let's just try to now see what may possibly happen, or, whether we gain predictability, which is what I've heard, or maybe we introduce even more unpredictability. What I'm trying to say is that it doesn't really matter if you were pro or against the verdict, if I may say so. There are companies out there which had different strategies. Some of them had to wait and see what's going to happen. Some of them were heavily into investment into green technologies, hoping to be rewarded or at least supported by the regulations, and that didn't go through. So no one really actually got any answer, I would say. And so my question, what, in your opinion, for example, when we see how do you deploy capital? Have we actually reached some more predictability over here, or we added some more unpredictability?
I would have liked to say yes to more predictability from a business perspective. Unfortunately, I think we didn't, because essentially two things. First, we've added unpredictability as to what the final outcome will be. Because I think that this is going to be tweaked, worked on, changed, choose whatever word you like. There will be a framework coming out of the IMO, but we don't quite know what it will look like. That creates unpredictability. Yep. The second part of it is whether we like it or not, the timeline is blown. So when are we going to be getting something coming out of the IMO? That is also more uncertain now than it used to be. So that's a second leg of unpredictability. And we actually have a third one.
Oh.
I started saying two, we have three. Because how is the rest of the world going to respond if they perceive the IMO as not really living up to expectations? And here I'm thinking specifically about the EU. What will the EU be doing with their own regulations? In light of what happened at the IMO, and what are they thinking now, and what will they be thinking in a year's time? That's another layer of unpredictability. So yeah, I don't think we have more predictability, rather the contrary.
But yeah, exactly. It seems like. But then also, what was the reaction of EU delegates? I mean, it seems like they were just sitting and observing what is really happening with IMO. I think there were certain expectations from them to IMO to come up with something, right?
I think they were they were stunned the same way as many of us were. You know that the Monty Python parrot skit. He's stunned.
He's stunned.
It was an unexpected outcome, as we started off talking about, and I don't think the EU members either expected to see it go this way. There were also some fragmentation within the EU camp when it came to the final vote to adjourn or not. There were some countries breaking with the rest of the EU's line. So I think they're also very much in let's think and reassess mode now. We may be getting some clear indications on where countries see this going, negotiation-wise, when we get to April next year, because at MEPC 84 there will be reassessing how the next or the continuation of the other meeting, the extraordinary session, what that shall look like after the coffee break, as it were. So at that point, you'll see if there is opening for making fundamental proposals for redesign, minor tweaks, if there will be a possibility to submit papers, or if we're just going to be very constrained in the way we run this in October. So that will give you April, well, essentially it's closing on 1st of May next year. That will give you some clear indications on how the process is going to play out. And that again gives you maybe not comfort, but a little bit more understanding of what that outcome might look like. I think it's going to lead to further, not necessarily postponement of decisions, but delays when it comes to final outcomes, for sure.
So no nervous movements, at least until April, you wouldn't see that happening?
Not publicly.
Not publicly, of course.
There's a lot of nervousness behind the scenes, and some of it is also leaking into the media coverage. You see stakeholders commenting.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, okay, well, let's go if not net zero framework, then do you see any chance of other regulations being strengthened?
I would say that if we don't get a global framework, and as you know, I mean, we would, from the DNV perspective, we really want to see a global framework,
yes,
a level playing field. The fragmentation is challenging. I would expect several things to happen. First off, we have several countries around the world looking into establishing their own ETS schemes. They are not necessarily very complex, but they come with added administrative burden and added costs. These are really taxation initiatives. It's about countries wanting to get their slice of the pie money-wise. And I think they will have gotten a leg up if the IMO does not manage to do anything. Then we have the second bit, of course, which is the EU. The EU is formally mandated to revise and review the ETS in 26 and Fuel EU Maritime in 27, and possibly make a so-called legislative proposal or proposals if the IMO manages to adopt something. Now, if the IMO doesn't manage to adopt something, I would not be surprised to see a tightening in EU regulations, to be honest. Both on the ETS side, where you might conceivably see a movement from a 50% coverage of voyages to 100% coverage. That would be a doubling of the costs on international voyages. I'm not saying it will happen, I'm saying it will be, it's a possibility. Yeah. And Fuel EU Maritime, the trajectory for Fuel EU Maritime, it doesn't go to zero. Yeah. It goes to down 80%. Yeah. It's an artifact really due to the time when it was agreed. I would not be surprised to see voices also saying that Fuel EU Maritime should be more ambitious and maybe even take the IMO trajectory as part of its. So. Again, I'm speculating, but there could be tightening there. And then, of course, we have the big canary in the coal mine, or whatever you want to call it, China and India and some of the other big players. Are they going to say that, well, we give up on the IMO, we need to do things domestically or not? If nothing else, than just to get our slice of the pie.
Well,
and we're not seeing indications of that happening now, but many countries have domestic ETS systems for land-based industry that easily can be applied to
the maritime,
to the maritime as well. So at least the discussion will start. I'm pretty sure. Who knows what the outcome is going to be? But I think there is, again, it adds to uncertainty. What will the future look like?
What will the future be, yeah. But I mean, we can at least speculate that this is that coffee break here, as you called it. This we will be mostly watched rather than seeing some countries demonstrating very aggressive actions.
Yes,
right up against.
I don't expect to see initiatives, the domestic initiatives, being rolled out per se as such during this year. But I think there will be a lot of internal policy discussions and maybe contingency planning. But I think would expect most work to be focused on, okay, what is going to be, can we tweak, work with the IMO to actually get an outcome there that is satisfactory from a global regulatory perspective. I think that's going to be the trajectory for the next 12 months or so.
Well, I mean, let's switch the gears into the last of the questions, or the sort of a block that I have, and it's more about the market and the new building market and the fleet in itself, because as we are very much engaged in the regulatory discussions and then trying to find a solution. I already alluded to, it's like what's better, is it the continuous improvement or late perfection, right?
Yeah.
But while those discussions are taking place, we have a world fleet that is aging and quite rapidly at the moment. We haven't really scrapped that many vessels over the past decades, at least as we should, which means the renewal is delayed, and frankly speaking, the energy efficiency doesn't grow by running old vessels, and it's not going to be all that easy to reverse that change, because there's a lot of voices out there say, well, we just need to start scrapping. I mean, if you really look into numbers, how much you would have to start scrapping in order to reverse that aging fleet trend, you would be really stunned, like that parrot you already alluded to. So the question is, then partly we see it, I mean, but do you expect, I know I'm a market analyst, I'm pushing this a little bit against you, but we already see quite a lot of capital launched for conventional vessels. Again, do you expect these things to happen? Those conventional vessels, as in my previous podcast, by the way, with Hanwha, I was corrected, they are not as conventional as the previous generations. So they're a lot more efficient vessels. And they do contribute to a growing efficiency rather than decreasing efficiency.
Yeah.
Is that perhaps we still should have them in, at least while we discuss those regulatory issues, before we have let's say, perfect solution. That's what I think. I mean, do you see more capital being launched now? Do you see people, and you talk to a lot of clients as well, I mean, do you see them sort of taking a breather a little bit?
Well, you're the market guy, I'm the regulatory guy.
I can tell you yes, that's what I've heard,
Yeah, but I from what I see, I mean, bear in mind, this is now, at the time we're recording this now, we are 3 weeks out from the meeting itself.
The dust hasn't settled yet.
The dust hasn't settled, people are thinking what their strategy should be. We are seeing discussions, of course, on whether it makes sense to go for more conventionally fueled vessels or not. I'm not sure if that's going to really be the final outcome, because I suspect that for many reasons, not least other regulatory regimes around the world, it does make sense to at least be ready for using alternative fuels. Yep. I think we're still seeing significant pickup of LNG, to be honest, because that's a proven and an economically viable solution even today. What the world is going to look like in a year's time?
I don't think in a year's time we can actually see any difference in that respect.
No, but I think that if you're going to look at what are your options, first off, when you say conventionally fueled vessels, I want to caveat that one a little bit, because you don't necessarily need to be able to burn very different molecules to actually save significantly on greenhouse gas emissions. Because if you're thinking on the biofuel space, these are drop-in fuels that can be used in conventionally fueled engines as well. So by using the word conventionally fueled as something that is old, dirty and fossil, that's not necessarily true. You can have very advanced vessels being configured for conventional hydrocarbons, but where the thinking is to burn biofuels. Again, this is in many ways you're avoiding the perfect being the enemy of the good in that sense. The second bit is when you look at energy efficiency, a conventionally fueled vessel can be energy efficient like there's no tomorrow if you're willing to make those investments. And with energy costs and compliance costs likely increasing over the time, many of the energy efficiency technologies that didn't necessarily make sense 2 years ago might make sense in 2-3 years into the future. So I think that we're looking at a nuanced picture here, to be honest.
Exactly, a slightly less of a risk if I were to sort of, speculate, because you pretty much take a bit of a gamble if we say, like, whether there's going to be enough biofuels available. Yeah. That's the big question mark. But you don't take a gamble of new technology. No, it's a proven technology. I mean, we've been running those engines for ages. You kind of reduce that risk profile into one or two factors.
You will have some added risks in the sense of availability of the fuel molecules, of course, as we talked about previously. Will that biofuel be available for you where you need it, when you need it, at the price point where you need it? So that goes back to the demand signal being sent to industry. What will be the demand pull for fuels in general? It's a complex picture, and I mean, my crystal ball is broken anyway, so I'm not going to speculate on availability. But as things stand today, it's early days. I do not see decarbonization as such as being something that's now dead in the water and behind us.
We're not trying to
it's more a question of some investment decisions on fuel supply being deferred until there is more certainty. I think that's going to happen. But when it comes to ships themselves, I really do not expect to see significant changes in the thinking over the coming year. Sure. If everything falls apart in a year's time at IMO, maybe we'll see something happen.
We will run another videocast on that.
Yeah, that's fine.
Also, one more thing, actually, and I'm not going to tease you as a sort of a market analyst, but you obviously see the room from the inside. Is there any, you can pick on any discussion where, when people start thinking about efficiency and what kind of ships we're going to run in the future, and in a lack of having enough of new ships coming in, retrofitting. That's something that owners are certainly looking into it, especially when you have a really high new building prices. They think like, okay, what about if I retrofit my vessel, if it's not too old, if it makes sense? Do you see any of discussions, or at least subjects like this being acknowledged?
I mean, and when we talk about retrofitting, it's not just retrofitting engines, because that's a horrendously expensive and complex process. But retrofitting of wind systems, for instance, that's a big one. We actually had a presentation during the meeting from a Norwegian company showing how the combination of wind and biofuels, in their case, was both cost efficient and hugely reducing CO2 emissions, of course. I think that those kinds of technologies are definitely going to be a subject of great discussion in many boardrooms around the world.
Yeah, okay.
Just as an example.
Just an example. Even though I have to tell you that I spoke with a few clients that even the re-engineering vessels it's sort of taking into account. It's not necessarily for all the ships, but those that last longer.
Yeah,
it's not necessarily a no-go.
No, I would agree, but I think it would depend on age. That's one thing. What kind of trade you're in, if you're on
a break-even,
and the break-even, longevity of the contracts, all those business aspects, I don't have to worry about in my day job. You have to.
Good for you.
Good for me.
Thank you very much, Eirik. This was great. And we haven't. You said, when I ask you more predictability and less predictability, you actually managed to come up with 3 answers to it, which tells me that we probably gain more unpredictability rather than anything else. But short term, perhaps, at least we take a breather. A coffee break for some, for others probably hard work. But let's hope for a better outcome next year. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jakub.
Thank you for joining our videocast. To quote Eirik, we are on a coffee break. A prolonged and quite busy coffee break, I must say, but it's not all over yet. Many aspects will need to be agreed upon, and certain concessions will be required for the net zero framework to be adopted and eventually come into force. I want to thank Eirik Nyhus, Director Environment for Maritime at DNV, for sharing his views and opinions from his very unique observation point at IMO. As always, we encourage you to explore all our resources available on our Maritime Impact online platform at dnv.com/mi. Stay tuned for the upcoming episodes of DNV Market Views. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.